Hello everybody, and welcome back to Cloud of Doubt's audio blog. Today we are going to look at an overview of modern U.S. economic theory, part 3 in our Types of U.S. Economic Thought series. We'll be looking at the theories of three of the most well-known economists, John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman, all of whom have had a major role in the shaping of modern U.S. economics here in the United States, as well as the rest of the world. That said, let's jump on in. In the early years, America's economy more or less maintained the integrity and foundational principles of laissez-faire. The private sector remained virtually unmolested with the exception of transportation from governmental interference. Many political figures held fast to the vision of hands-off free market capitalism, that is, until the near later part of the 19th century. At this time, many in the middle class began asking the federal government to use its power to protect them from the radical small business, farm, and labor movements which began to show themselves. These people, known as progressives, favored government regulation of business practices to ensure competition and free enterprise. They also found corruption in the public sector. During this time of U.S. economic reform, many of the regulatory agencies which still exist today were created. Agencies such as the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, and the Federal Trade Commission. The most interference by government occurred as a result of the 1929 stock market crash, leading to the Great Depression and the emergency launching of the New Deal in the 1930s. Conti remarked the following: "Many of the most important laws and institutions that define Americans' modern economy can be traced to the New Deal era. New Deal legislation extended federal authority in banking, agriculture, and public welfare. It established minimum standards for wages and hours on the job, and it served as a catalyst for the expansion of labor unions in such industries such as steel, automobiles, and rubber. Programs and agencies that today seem indispensable to the operation of the country's modern economy were created. The Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates the stock market. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guarantees bank deposits. And perhaps most notably, the Social Security system, which provides pensions to the elderly based on contributions they made when they were part of the workforce." As a result of the New Deal, the emergence of progressives and a weakness in the market to correct itself led to the trampling of laissez-faire principles to the point of no return, giving birth to our modern-day economy. It was left to modern-day free market economists such as John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, and even though much later, Milton Friedman, to pick up the pieces and attempt to reconcile the damage done and potentially stitch the interference of federal government with a free market to preserve whatever integrity was left of laissez-faire, albeit very little. The first economist we'll be looking at is John Maynard Keynes. John Maynard Keynes was a British economist whose ideas gave birth to the Keynesian economic school of thought. Throughout the Great Depression, Keynes' ideas, which insisted government policies interfere with the free market, made a dramatic impact on the United States as well as the rest of the world. Before World War II, many of his policies were enacted in the United States, and by the 1970s, almost every capitalistic economy in the world had adopted the Keynesian model. Keynes' main premise was that free markets were not self-regulating. Contesting the driving principle of laissez-faire was wrong. In other words, he argued that recession and high employment were a result of insufficient spending in the private sector, opposing the classical thought that private industry was subject to the boom and bust or the up and down cycle nature of economy. Herein are the founding principles of Keynesian economic thought and criticisms of classical economic thought. Prime theory of Keynes was that of aggregate demand and unemployment. Aggregate demand, often called the effective demand, is the total demand for goods and services within an economy at a given time, otherwise considered the demand for the gross domestic product or GDP of a country. It is essentially an analysis of supply and demand. Keynesian theory suggests that this aggregate demand is the number one driving factor for the economy, and that with a low aggregate demand, it can cause periods of high unemployment. As aggregate demand lessens, the amount of spending in the economy goes down, which thus stifles businesses, causing a dramatic shrink in production, investment, and innovation. Therefore, Keynes suggests that it is the government's responsibility to create policies to drive the spending of its citizens, and for the government to jumpstart the economy by spending itself, even through deficit spending. These acts of spending and policy making will essentially boost the economy back to a point negating the high employment levels and manipulating the business cycle to no longer experience busts. Jahan outlines this theory quite nicely. Keynes argued that inadequate overall demand could lead to prolonged periods of high unemployment. An economy's output of goods and services is the sum of four components: consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports, which is essentially the difference between what a country sells to and buys from foreign countries. Any increase in demand has to come from one of these four components. But during a recession, strong forces often dampen demand as spending goes down. For example, during economic downturns, uncertainty often erodes consumer confidence, causing them to reduce their spending, especially on discretionary purchases like a house or a car. This reduction in spending by consumers can result in less investment spending by businesses as firms respond to weakened demand for their products. This puts the task of increasing output on the shoulders of the government. According to Keynesian economics, state intervention is necessary to moderate the booms and busts in economic activity, otherwise known as the business cycle. The Keynesian theory of aggregate demand leads to what is known as a mixed economy. Heavily contrary to laissez-faire theory, Keynesian theory calls for a support of a mixed economy, an economy driven by the private industries but guided by the policies of the government. Furthermore, it is felt that decisions of businesses can have such adverse macroeconomic outcomes, such as reduction in consumer spending during a recession, and that these market failures sometimes call for active policies by the government, such as a fiscal stimulus package. In order to support all of this spending, Keynesians support the idea of borrow or print and spend. The concept of borrow and spend is a heavily Keynesian idea. The thought is that because government intervention is required in the economy during periods of downturn, it must spend money to jump over the hurdles caused by the bust cycle of the market economy, compared to the laissez-faire theory of the market self-regulating themselves back to booming. However, the government does not always have the funds to spend. Therefore, they must borrow or print the money to trigger further spending at the consumer level. Keynes made the point himself. Individuals must be induced to spend more through the expenditure of borrowed or printed money. While there is much debate of the effects of borrowing versus printing the money to spend, the concept of government-induced spending is an inherent principle of Keynesian philosophy. Friedrich Hayek, on the other hand, was an Australian-British economist who shared the 1974 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences with Gunnar Myrdal for his pioneering work in the theory of money and economic fluctuations and penetrating analysis for the interdependence of economic, social, and institutional phenomena. Though Hayek and Keynes shared a mutual respect for one another, Keynes even nominated Hayek for Fellow of the British Academy. Hayek was the antithesis of John Maynard Keynes, serving as a defender of classical liberalism and laissez-faire economics as portrayed by Harvard economist and former Harvard University president Lawrence Summers. What's the single most important thing to learn from an economics course today? What I try to leave my students with is the view that the invisible hand is more powerful than the unhidden hand. Things will happen in well-organized efforts without direction, controls, plans. That's the consensus among economists. That's the Hayek legacy. While Hayek transpired his theories of economy around the same time as Keynes, he was not noticed until the 1980s, with the rise of conservative governments. Though Hayek did not attribute himself as a conservative, he acknowledged many of the principles lined up with his. Yet, he considered himself in the United States landscape a libertarian. Hayek wrote in an essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative, included in the appendix to the Constitution of Liberty, in which he disparaged conservatism for its inability to adapt to the changing human realities or to offer a positive political program, remarking, Conservatism is only as good as what it conserves. Although he noted that modern-day conservatism shares many opinions on economics with classical liberals, particularly a belief in the free market, he believed it is because conservatism wants to stand still, whereas liberalism embraces the free market because it wants to go somewhere. Hayek identified himself as a classical liberal, but he noted that in the United States it had become almost impossible to use liberal in its original definition, and the term libertarian has been used instead. In this text, Hayek also opposed conservatism for its hostility to internationalism and its proneness to a strident nationalism, with its frequent association with imperialism. Hayek inspired a reinvigorated appreciation for laissez-faire. After heavy stagflation, or high amounts of unemployment and inflation, occurred in the 1970s, which carried through to the 1980s and again since the 2008 financial crisis. Many policies instituted as a result of Keynes' school of thought were heavily scrutinized and some changed as a hands-off approach made a comeback. Outlined are the thoughts of Hayek's Austrian School of Economics. Hayek's landmark theory was that of the Hayek and Mises business cycle. In short, the Hayek-Mises business cycle theorizes that the business cycle's booms and busts are the consequences of excessive growth in back credit due to artificially low interest rates set by the central fractional reserve banks. The business cycle is regarded as normal within the free market landscape. Unlike Keynes, who believed government was the cure to alleviating large amplitudes of highs and lows in the business cycle, Hayek affirmed that government intervention only made the cycles much worse. The business cycle, inflation, and high nominal interest rates are not caused by the free market, but by government's monetary and fiscal policies. Without government intervention, the free market economy would reflect 1. Stable interest rates, probably in the 2 to 3% range, as in the 1950s. 2. No inflation. In fact, historically, average prices have tended to decline slightly with the free market and a gold standard. 3. Low unemployment. No minimum wage laws and forced collective bargaining, which keep wages artificially high during a recession. 4. High savings rate. Contrary to standard Keynesian doctrine, high personal saving rates are good for economic growth. And 5. Economic growth without recessions or depressions. But as long as government is ubiquitous and controls the supply of money, it will appear that capitalism is inherently unstable, as the Marxists say. Only the wise student of history and economic science knows that government policy, not the free market, is responsible for economic instability. First, the inflationary boom. The Fed expands the money supply by purchasing treasury securities from banks. Profits in capital-intensive industries tend to rise, and because the stock market is highly capital-intensive, the stock market goes to a bull market. However, in the later stages of the inflationary boom, consumer prices start catching up, the stock market loses its luster, and the bull market ends. Also, at the end of the inflationary cycle, gold, silver, and other inflationary hedges move up sharply. Second, the credit crunch. Once consumer prices start rising sharply, the interest rates start edging up. The Fed usually puts on the brakes and causes a credit crunch. Interest rates rise rapidly as capital industries scramble for funds to escape bankruptcy. Third, recession. Production of capital goods falls more sharply than consumer goods. Gross national products decline and stocks continue to fall. Interest rates rise, dropping as demand for credit declines. Prices for commodities and capital goods tend to fall more sharply than consumer goods, which sometimes continue to rise. It's also known as an inflationary recession. Fourth, economic recovery. The recession in capital goods ends as the economy returns to stability. In short, to establish a better laissez-faire approach, the removal of government's interference in the maintenance and creation of the nation's money supply is required. This leads to choice theory. Hayek explored many aspects and fields of choice theory and one's ability to make their own decisions. In the area of economy, he felt citizens should have the opportunity to choose their own investments, goods and services, and currencies in which they use to buy things. This idea was a way to provide a check against the government's intervention in affecting the balance of free market outcomes. Though no exact solution is given, it is a creative idea to diminish the total power of central banks within individual countries. To further expand, at length, Hayek said, "All people should be free to use any currency of their own choosing, even if that means rejecting the favored domestic one. This provides a check against inflation, permitting citizens to keep assets denominated in any unit. Governments, then, would have a greater incentive to avoid inflating because a depreciating unit would lead people to flee to other currencies. At least this would work as some check, and it would be a great improvement over the existing system in which citizens in a currency region are caged sheep led to the slaughter." By giving the people the right to choose freely, governments and free market enterprise are forced to serve them the best goods and services, best investments, and best money, or they could be left in the dust as the free people are able to find alternatives. Hayek had some Keynes criticism, which led from the 1930s to the late 70s. Keynesian theory was in full swing, used in almost every capitalistic country. However, it wasn't until the 1970s and the 1980s that Hayek theory began to receive prestige as a result of stagflation, or high unemployment accompanied with high inflation, which had been triggered by the application of Keynesian policies and expansion and growth of government. This blatant failure of Keynesian theory granted a look into Hayek's theories by the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Since then, many modern-day researchers see expansionary monetary policies and too low interest rates as malincentives and main drivers of the financial crises in general, and the subprime market crises in particular. To prevent problems caused by monetary policy, many have looked into alternatives such as free banking and an unnationalized currency such as Bitcoin. It is said that monetary policy and mounting regulation have undermined the innovative forces of the market economies. Quantitative easing following the financial crises is argued to have not only conserved structural distortions in the economy, leading to a fall in trend growth, it also created new distortions and contributes to distributional conflicts. What about Hayek's criticism of collectivism? Unlike Keynes, who was willing to sacrifice individualism to achieve full employment, Hayek was unwilling to allow such a compromise, asserting governmental action led to an even greater risk in creating a totalitarian society. Hayek argued the government's role was simply enforcing the rule of law with as little intervention as possible, and any collectivisms, i.e., socialism, could be maintained by a central authority of some kind. Hayek supported this with the road to serfdom when he proclaimed, "Although our modern socialist promise of greater freedom is genuine and sincere, in recent years observer after observer has been impressed by the unforeseen consequences of socialism, and the extraordinary similarity in many respects of the conditions under communism and fascism." Hayek was also supportive of social safety nets. While Hayek despised government intervention into the affairs of private industry, he did acknowledge that government could maintain a role in the economy in the way of establishing safety nets for its citizens. Further expressing his views, he wrote, "There is no reason why, in a society which has reached the general level of wealth as ours has, the first kind of security should not be guaranteed to all without endangering general freedom, that is, some minimum of food, shelter, and clothing, sufficient to preserve health, nor is there any reason why the state should not help to organize a comprehensive system of social insurance in providing for those common hazards of life against which few can make adequate provision." Though Hayek valued one's personal freedom above all else, he saw no confliction between the personal freedom and the establishment of safety nets providing free health care, food, clothing, or shelter. In contrast to John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman was an American economist. He had received the 1976 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for his research in the fields of consumption analysis, monetary history and theory, and for his demonstration of the complexity of stabilization policy. He also served as an advisor for both U.S. President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Friedman is essentially the hybrid prodigy child of Keynes and Hayek. He saw through the naivetes of Keynesian and Austrian philosophies of economics and more or less took the best of both theories, acknowledging the weaknesses and strengths, and providing a usable workflow which could be used in the United States to serve as a true hybrid laissez-faire implementation of free market principles. Though Friedman was more Austrian-leaning and opposed many Keynesian-style government policies, he described his approach as utilizing Keynesian language and apparatus while rejecting its initial conclusions. In short, he fostered the free market principles while trying to ensure minimal government interference. One of Friedman's earliest economic contributions was described in his A Theory of the Consumption Function in 1957, which led to his novel finding: if households do not perceive their permanent income as changing, they will maintain their established spending patterns. For more detail, Britannica Academic gives a full breakdown describing, "The idea is that a household's consumption and savings decisions are more affected by changes in its permanent income than by income changes that household members perceive as temporary or transitory, The permanent income hypothesis provided an explanation for some puzzles that had emerged in the empirical data concerning the relationship between the average and marginal propensities to consume. It also helped to explain why, for example, fiscal policies in the form of a tax increase, if perceived as temporary, might not lead to the intended reductions in consumption. Instead, the increased tax might be financed out of savings, leaving consumption levels unchanged. In contrast to Keynes' ideas asserting that simply creating and spending money at the government level would help foster spending money at the consumer level, Friedman found that unless the consumers themselves felt they were perceiving a change in their income, regardless of how much the government was spending, they would not alter their spending habits in the free market. Friedman is referred to as the founder of quantity theory of money, or monetarism, which is a school of economic thought that maintains that the money supply, or the total amount of money in the economy, in the form of coin, currency, and bank deposits, is a chief determinant on the demand side of short-run economic activity. Unlike the Keynesians, who believe fiscal policy, adjustments in spending levels and tax rates to monitor and influence the nation's economy, was more effective than monetary policy, adjustments to a nation's money supply, credit, and interest rates, in counteracting the effects of a recession or the bust cycle. Friedman promoted that changes in the money supply affect real economic activity in the short run and the price level in the long run. Friedman subsequently published, with co-author Anna J. Schwartz, A Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960. Within, he combined theoretical and empirical analysis, which gave an intricately detailed account of the role of money in the United States economy since the Civil War. In addition to A Monetary History of the United States, Friedman also wrote Two Lucky People, where, in both works, he blamed government policies in furthering exacerbating the effects of the Great Depression, saying, "The Fed was largely responsible for converting what might have been a garden variety recession, although perhaps a fairly severe one, into a major catastrophe. Instead of using its powers to offset the Depression, it presided over a decline in the quantity of money by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. Far from the Depression being a failure of the free enterprise system, it was a tragic failure of government." Throughout the history of the United States, the more laissez-faire principles were ignored, the worse its economy got. Only when reconciling the government's relationship with classically liberal theories of economy did the economy truly grow. While Friedman is known for many theories of which contributed to his Nobel Prize in economics, his development of the concept of the natural rate of unemployment was cited as the main motivation behind the award. In short, the natural rate of unemployment when an economy is in a steady state of full employment is the proportion of the workforce who are unemployed. Put another way, this concept clarifies that the economic term full employment does not mean zero unemployment. While Keynesians believed in the findings behind the Phillips curve that a stable trade-off exists between the rate of wage inflation and the unemployment rate, Friedman argued that the trade-off was temporary and depended on workers being fooled by unanticipated wage inflation into thinking that a rise in their nominal wage was a rise in their real wage, thus inducing them to produce more output. Furthermore, the stagflation of the 1970s, literally a combination of economic stagflation and inflation, and impossible in a simplified Keynesian framework, was seen by many as a confirmation of Friedman's hypothesis. This finding ended the domination of the Keynesian model in macroeconomics and shifted the pendulum in the other direction in favor of Austrian-style reforms, or laissez-faire, albeit a hybrid version. In this part of the series, an overview was given of how classical economy transformed into the hybridized laissez-faire system we have today. In the next video, we will compare and contrast these modern theories. Though these economists were varied in their nature, sometimes they actually overlap. So you can read this article, along with many others, as well as see their sources on cloudofdoubt.com. To be notified of our blog posts, you can subscribe on cloudofdoubt.com, or you can follow us on a variety of other social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, Google+, Pinterest, and Minds.com. The links are down below in the video description. If you have any comments about this video, please comment below. We'd love to hear what you have to say. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you would like to be notified when new videos are posted, please subscribe and enable notifications. All of this helps YouTube know that this is quality content that you like and enjoy, and it will recommend videos like these to other viewers like you. Stay tuned for the next video, and we will look forward to seeing and hearing from you in the future. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay informed.